Instead of getting drowsier, she was getting more awake, with an odd nighttime, dreamish kind of wakefulness. The creek was growing brighter. She knew now that the moon was on it, though she couldn't see the moon. And now she began to feel that the whole forest was coming awake like herself. Hardly knowing why she did it, she got up quickly and walked a little distance away from there. "This is lovely," said Lucy to herself. It was cool and fresh. Delicious smells were floating everywhere. Somewhere close by she heard the twitter of a nightingale, beginning to sing, then stopping, then beginning again. It was a little lighter ahead. She went toward the light and came to a place where there were fewer trees, and whole patches of pools of moonlight. But the moonlight and the shadows so mixed that you could hardly be sure where anything was or what it was. At the same moment, the nightingale, satisfied at last with his tuning up, burst into full song. Lucy's eyes began to grow accustomed to the light, and she saw the trees that were nearest her more distinctly. A great longing for the old days when the trees could talk in Narnia came over her. She knew exactly how each of these trees would talk if only she could wake them, and what sort of human form it would put on. She looked at a silver birch. It would have a soft, showery voice, and would look like a slender girl, with hair blown all about her face, and fond of dancing. She looked at the oak. He would be a wizened but hardy old man with a frizzled beard and warts on his face and hands, and hair growing out of the warts. She looked at the beech under which she was standing. Ah, she would be the best of all. She would be a gracious goddess, smooth and stately, the lady of the wood. "Oh, trees, trees, trees," said Lucy, though she had not been intending to speak at all. "Oh, trees, wake, wake, wake. Don't you remember it? Don't you remember me, dryads and hamadryads? Come out, come to me." Though there was not a breath of wind, they all stirred about her. The rustling noise of the leaves was almost like words. The nightingale stopped singing as if to listen to Lucy. Lucy felt that at any moment she would begin to understand what the trees were trying to say, but the moment did not come. The rustling died away. The nightingale resumed its song. Even in the moonlight, the wood looked more ordinary again. Yet Lucy had the feeling, as you sometimes have when you're trying to remember a name or a date and almost get it, but it vanishes before you really do, that she had just missed something. As if she had spoken to the trees a split second too soon or a split second too late, or used all the right words except one, or put in one word that was just wrong.
I was pointing out last time that the Christian life is simply a process of having your natural self changed into a Christ self.
All right, welcome to the Inklings Variety Hour, where a handful of Inklings enthusiasts read and discuss the works of C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, and others. Megan couldn't be here because she's trying to start a forest creature rebellion in the woods, and Annika was going to come but suddenly realized she left her torch in Narnia. But filling in for them today, we have a veritable army of Aslan-besotted Maenads and Berserkers. I'm Chris Pipkin. You met our producer, Logan Huggins, last time. With us as well, though, we have Sophie Burkhardt of the podcast Beneath the Willow Tree, where she muses on philosophy, theology, and literature. How are you doing, Sophie?
Splendid, splendid.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we also have author Mez Blume, who is known for having written the Katie Watson Mysteries in Time series and Churchill's S.O.C.s, which I highly recommend. She says she's been tremendously influenced as an author and human being by C.S. Lewis, but she can tell you all about that. How are you doing, Mez?
I am tickled to be here, Chris.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Logan, how are you?
I am very well. I have my electric torch, and I have rallied all the local woodland creatures, and we are ready to start a war.
Good, good.
So in other words, just a normal Tuesday afternoon. So
That's
yeah,
right.
We're doing great.
That's right. Prince Caspian was C.S. Lewis's second book in his Chronicles of Narnia series, published in 1951. It was finished before he published, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's, to my mind, both the most awkward Narnia book, but still a lot better than the movie. It has moments of brilliant beauty and insight, perhaps even more so than The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. What do you all think about this book in relation to the original? Do you like it more? Do you like it less than The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe?
I think it depends on when I read it and the sweet spots that it hits. For me, sometimes it is just a matter of where you are in life, and sometimes certain scenes just reach out and grab you. So this one has had very pertinent meaning for me at certain times.
I don't think Prince Caspian is my favorite. It's probably my third favorite because I do rank them.
Wow.
The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Magician's Nephew, I think is my favorite.
Okay.
But I love, I think the part that Mez read at the beginning is one of my favorite scenes in all of the Narnia books. And so I love the feeling of the trees coming back to life slowly but surely as Aslan nears.
Yeah, I am a big fan of Prince Caspian. It reminds me of like a second season of a TV show, if I can use a TV analogy. Like, we've already got the setup. We know these characters. We don't have to spend too long introducing the world. We're in it. And now everyone's ready to go. We're hit the ground running again, so to speak. But I'm a big fan of Prince Caspian. I don't know if I would put it above Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe because it is such a classic, but it's pretty highly rated up there.
I enjoy it partly because there are so many moments where, and I think more so than a lot of his other books, although perhaps when I get to these other books in the podcast, I'll find moments like this in the other books as well. But there's so many moments where things just seem as though they could be taking place on our world, especially with the four Pevensey kids. And there are so many moments when this sort of enchantment kind of intrudes in what seems like an ordinary sort of forest scene, like what we just read at the top, or beach scene, or going to ruins and suddenly realizing, oh shoot, this is the castle we used to rule from, right? Moments like that are really interesting. They're really sort of textured. I feel like if it was a smoother book, and if Lewis had quite figured out exactly what he was doing with Narnia by this point, it might not have been as full of these kinds of moments. Last time, Logan and I talked about the first half of Prince Caspian, in which Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy find themselves in Narnia about 1,000 years after the time they reigned as kings and queens. They learn from a dwarf named Trumpkin that unimaginative humans named Telmarines have colonized the former kingdom of talking beasts and driven the magical folk far underground, but that one of the Telmarines, their rightful king, Caspian, has gathered the old Narnians together under his banner and is fighting his usurping uncle Miraz in order to reclaim his throne and usher in a new age in which humans and magical folk can get along with each other. The four old kings and queens think that sounds like a pretty good plan. So after proving to the skeptical Trumpkin that they are indeed the ancient rulers of old, they set off to help Caspian. But first, they have a lot of wilderness to navigate. Mez and Sophie, did I leave anything out since you weren't part of the conversation last time? Is there something else that's important to note as we move forward?
I think maybe just the emphasis that you have on old stories, and just since that plays such a pivotal role in when Caspian is growing up with his tutor and with his nurse as well, and just how that ends up, because throughout the course of the book it ends up shaping how these different characters are going to respond to Aslan and what kind of role they're going to play.
Yeah, Lewis has a lot to say in this book, much of it negative about education, which is going to be a fun thing to talk about. But yeah, definitely, like, tutors are good in Lewis's mind. Classrooms, maybe not so good. Caspian seems to have gotten the right kind of education, right? And that's key, and that's important, from Dr. Cornelius, who ends up joining his rebellion. We talked a little bit about the weirdness for the Pevensey kids of going back to being young in a place where you kind of like grew into adulthood and like ruled and had authority, right? As well as how this seems in some ways to like kind of be a sequel about writing sequels. The kids are sort of stumbling forward through the forest, trying to find out if this actually is Narnia and where the action actually is. We also talked about how the Bible, the Gospels and Acts, could possibly map onto The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe and Prince Caspian, and how in the world two dwarves from two different tribes might have ended up living with a badger. Logan floated the idea that maybe it was Craigslist ad. We also talked about how this book has a lot of named characters, definitely more than in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. Mez, I think you mentioned something about the Telmarines.
Yeah, I find it interesting that, as Sophie said, we're living in this world of Narnia now where the old stories have been forgotten. And I feel like there's a dichotomy of characters that Lewis sets up and kind of lets us try on different worldviews. And some of those are simply of the mindset that it's all old wives' tales. The tales about Aslan and talking beasts is just something for children, a nursery story. But then you have those who I think are just who know the truth, who know the true history, and are trying to suppress it and trying to kind of, for their own ends, keep that secret hidden. So I find that an interesting play where you kind of have, I guess, a representation of the modern materialist who just takes everything as fact. And then you have those who are tampering with a spirituality but don't profess Christ. But we'll get on to that.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and I think it tracks in a weird way with the idea of how talking beasts come to be talking beasts versus non-talking beasts. Because I wonder if this is two distinct kinds of Telmarines, those who, for their own reasons, want to keep stories about the past quiet, and then those who simply don't know about it, and to what extent the actively suppressing that truth sort of shades into ignorance in a similar way to the way that the beasts, can sort of become wild and then gradually turn into dumb beasts. But yeah, that might be completely wrong, and there might actually be, like, Trumpkin versus the Telmarines. Trumpkin really does seem honestly to not believe all this old stuff about
Right.
about Aslan.
An honest doubter versus a sort of, an underhanded, because we get from Dr. Cornelius that information, those old stories are incredibly dangerous. So there's clearly more going on than just, oh, these are for the nursery. It's profoundly important and dangerous information to have.
So we'll go ahead. We'll pick up on chapter 9, what Lucy saw. The children are tired after rowing to the mainland all day in the sun, and Lucy wakes up in the middle of the night, and after looking at the stars, has this feeling that the trees really could wake up again. And this is something both the stars and the trees in this book really strike me as being hugely important, as these things that are both still and dependable, but also moving, especially at the right times, right? And they seem to kind of come together for this moment of kairos, right? This moment of like, now things are really going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, I love this scene in general because I think it's such a beautiful picture of what Lewis talks about so much, especially in Surprised by Joy, over the notion of like sin-soaked and this inexpressible longing that just sort of shoots through you. And I think Lucy has that moment here. I mean, Lewis is always alluding to George MacDonald. He calls him, right, his master. And I know the beech tree in Phantastes plays this huge role of this protective woman. And so just sort of seeing the beech tree have that same sort of role here with Lucy was a little nod to him. And I think that could be, I mean, trees just play such an important role in all of this whole line of authors that you have throughout history. And so I think Lewis is also sort of tapping into this long history of that.
Yeah, absolutely. George MacDonald all over this book in bigger and smaller ways. Absolutely.
I think you really hit on something, Chris, when you talked about sort of the permanence of the stars and the trees. And I think the theme that Sophie really emphasized at the start of the old stories and the old ways, I feel like Lewis really uses these characters really of stars and of trees because they're old, because they've outlived all of the other characters. They've seen the days of creation. They have memories. And of course, throughout Narnia, he makes a special kind of tribute to stars and trees as being more than just their material makeup. We get in Dawn Treader the conversation about the star, and Eustace says, well, it's in our country, it's just balls of burning gas, and learns that that's what a star is made of, but not what a star is. And then finally, at the end of the Chronicles, the stars come down and worship Aslan, more or less. So I feel like you've hit on something there where these trees and these stars have preserved the truth, and they continue, like in scripture, how the stones will cry out when man fails to praise God. The trees and the stars are still there worshiping for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear.
Yeah, I love the fact that they are old, that there are other ways to know the past, right? And especially in a world where like parts of creation can just kind of like talk to you about as or like you could summon a king from like 1,000 years ago, who's a little school child.
To jump in real quick,
Yeah.
I think you see this theme of Lewis holding up and sort of giving honor to nature in so many of his books, and so many characters have these almost sort of revelations with nature. You see it all throughout the Space trilogy or the Ransom trilogy with Ransom as he gets to Malacandria, as he gets to Paralandra. There's these huge, beautiful passages of this overwhelming sense of awe that he sees of the created space, of these new planets, of Venus and then of Mars. It literally changes him because he's just so overwhelmed with the beauty and the purity and the majesty of nature. And as y'all were talking about this scene here of Lucy experiencing the trees, it even in a weird way reminded me of that passage on Till We Have Faces about how Orwell, she's so close to having this revelation about the gods. She gets closest to sort of understanding the truth about the gods when she's opening herself up to how beautiful this nature scene is when she's going up the Gray Mountain. Why shouldn't my heart dance? I'm going to misquote it, but why not?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. Then why shouldn't my heart dance when she's looking at this beautiful ravine and these beautiful flowers and the trees? And it's obviously she makes the choice not to do that, where we see Lucy choosing to jump in and join in the dance. And we see Ransom in his books joining the dance and joining the glory of nature there too. So Lewis uses nature to cause great changes and great transformations for his characters in so many of his books.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a re-enchantment. And this book very much deals with that, right? This book is very much about re-enchantment of the world, which is part of why those passages with Lucy are so important, I think, is you're taking a world that seems to be in some ways bereft of magic and re-infusing it with like good Aslanic magic rather than bad werewolfian
hags and witches. And
we don't need any of those. Yeah.
And this might be jumping ahead a bit, but while you're talking about re-enchantment, I think that may be why Lewis has a beef with education in this book. I'm just thinking of when he talks about men without chest and his day modern education, how it's all about the disenchantment of the world, of the word just. We can just explain things rationally. So I feel like that's where he's kind of holding up this re-enchanted world of the childlike vision, childlike faith with modern education, Freudianism, the move to dry things out and rationalize everything. Maybe that is a big reason why schools get such a bad beef in Prince Caspian.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because his tutor, the Great Knock, was definitely of that stripe. It seems like, right? He's an atheist and ready to reduce things and be very precise in his arguments, right? At least as far as Surprised by Joy says. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. This is the tendency of modern education, and it totally tracks with the abolition of man. Absolutely. So that in order for man to not be abolished, these other things that seem to rival man must be restored, because otherwise you're not ruling over anything, right? You're ruling over emptiness that makes you empty. There's a fullness of humanity that comes when creation is re-enchanted. So they get lost in the wood quite a few times in this chapter. They shoot a bear. Susan's about to shoot him, but she's worried, shoot, what if it's a talking bear? And at that moment, Trumpkin, lets an arrow fly. They have this little conversation because Susan said, I was afraid it was a talking bear. And Trumpkin says, that's the trouble of it. When most of the beasts have gone enemy and gone dumb, but there are still some of the other kind left. You never know, and you daren't wait to see. So at this point, at least, this is interesting to me because the animals, rather than kind of having Aslan portion out some animals to be, and you will be the talking beasts and you will be the dumb beasts, there seems to be like almost kind of a continuum rather than like a either or thing. Like beasts can sort of become, which like tracks with a lot of the other stuff that Lewis has said about animals, right? Where like the tame condition of the animal is more in some ways preferable to the wild condition of an animal because it's through human beings that creation, that nature is redeemed, right? Just as it's through Christ that humanity is redeemed. It made me think, is Lewis dealing with two different explanations for why there are some animals that are talking and some animals that are dumb, or is it pretty reconcilable with, stuff that we see the magician's nephew later on, where there's one set that's talking, one set that's dumb?
And even at the end of Prince Caspian, he talks about how Reepicheep and the mice used to not be talking, but then they were given the gift of that through when they chewed off Aslan's cords when he was bound. So I would imagine it reconciles in that way, that at any point Aslan could grant non-talking beasts the ability to talk. And the notion of talking beasts being able to revert as well.
Yeah. We're getting into like notions of soteriology and things like this. Like, notice that the mice chewed Aslan's bonds first, right? So it's like a reward for something good that the mice did because they were more tame. Maybe they just happen to be chewing on that bond and it's like kind of like a relic that like heals you or gives you powers or something like that.
But actually, that's a good point, because Lewis isn't saying that a non-talking beast is a bad beast. He's just saying that it's not preferable. Like you're saying, the tame beast is preferable, but that doesn't mean that a wild beast is a negative thing, but it has room to grow. So I guess it depends on the direction the beast is going. The mice were going in the right direction towards sentience, towards relationship with Aslan, whereas these beasts that we meet in Prince Caspian have presumably once been talking beasts, but have forgotten, whether through that kind of inherited ignorance or willfully of their own sort of rebellion. So it seems very much like a sense of, the lion's breath has given life to all of these things, but they've removed themselves from the influence of the lion's breath, so that they're getting further and further from the relational quality that brings sentience to these talking creatures.
Just to add on to that, totally, I think you can even say the same thing about the river spirits and the tree spirits themselves. They're not in their fulfillment of acting and dancing and doing this. It's through the sort of the oppression of the Telmarines, the sort of forgetting of the old stories, that they slowly become normal trees, or the bridge sort of hampers the spirit of the river god, or, all these sort of mythical creatures and sort of like super creatures. They sort of revert back to their plain, boring terrestrial cells. It's definitely, I see it as sort of a product or byproduct of that ignorance over time, or just sort of the influence of the Telmarine sort of like oppressing that true nature that Aslan is, and I guess Lewis designed Narnia to be.
And isn't that the case for the humans in the story as well? The disenchanted humans who become there's some horrible descriptions, but the stumpy fat-legged little girls and the pinched-faced teachers as well.
Yeah, that is, I am looking forward to talking about that chapter, because it's all kinds of weird. So one thing that Lucy says that we probably don't have time to talk about, because we need to get on to the next chapter. Lucy says, kind of touching what we've been talking about, wouldn't it be dreadful if someday in our own world at home men started going wild inside like the animals here and still looked like men, so that you never know which were which? I'm pretty sure directly from the sequel to George MacDonald's Princess and the Goblin, The Princess and Curdie, where Curdie is given by kind of like that story's version of Aslan, who's like a old lady who seems young and old at the same time. He's given the ability to feel with his hands what sort of animal different humans that he meets are turning into when he like shakes their hands. It's and like they're sort of slowly turning into beasts in certain cities because of vice of different kinds, and other people are slowly becoming better. But it's interesting because for George MacDonald, it's a way of sort of picturing hell, even though George MacDonald doesn't exactly like think that hell is where anybody ends up in the end.
Off of that, and I keep referencing the space trilogy, but it is my favorite. It reminds me of what you can sort of say about the villains in That Hideous Strength.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at all the sort of main villains, they're human, but they sort of get corrupted over time into sort of in different ways. One of them sort of becomes like a shell of a man, but he's very, very eloquent,
Mm-hmm.
and he's very well talked, and he'll sweep you off your feet, but then you stop and think like he's not saying anything. He's just literally an empty man. And there's this other character where at the end he's like, his mind is screaming to like do something, get out, but his body just won't respond because he has been so beat down and sort of devolved into this shell of humanity because he in with the evil side, to oversimplify that awesome story. But yeah, you see Lewis do that time and time again. You see that in the space trilogy where the bad guys devour themselves or are devoured by their own means and by their own forces, essentially.
Yeah, and if I could just put out a quick trailer for later on in this season, we're going to be talking about Descent into Hell by Charles Williams, which is very much part of the place where Lewis is getting some of these ideas of like, well, acts of kindness will continue to cause you to act kindly toward people, right? And draw you up toward heaven, right? Acts of selfishness isolate you more and more and more. And there's this just slow progress in one direction or regress in the other. Is regress the right word? Degress?
Ungress, I believe.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Let's go on to chapter 10, Return of the Lion. I think that this is where Lewis finds his muse, and his muse is Aslan. Sort of figures out kind of what the book is about. I think it's the best chapter so far. There's too much to talk about all of it. Basically, the Pevensie kids and Trumpkin continue their secular path and nearly get killed by arrows, realizing that Lucy was right, because Lucy said, "Hey, I see Aslan over there," and nobody else could, and she knew that Aslan wanted her to follow him, and she did not. And Lucy wakes up that night, and lo and behold, the trees are awakened. Lucy looked very hard at the trees of that glade. "Why, I do believe they're moving," she said to herself. "They're walking about." She got up, her heart beating wildly, and walked towards them. There was certainly a noise in the glade, a noise such as trees make in high wind, though there was no wind tonight. Yet it was not exactly an ordinary tree noise either. Lucy felt there was a tune in it, but she could not catch the tune any more than she had been able to catch the words when the trees had so nearly talked to her the night before. But there was at least a lilt. She felt her own feet wanting to dance as she got nearer, and now there was no doubt that the trees were really moving in and out through one another, as if in a complicated country dance. And I suppose, thought Lucy, when trees dance, it must be a very, very country dance indeed. She was almost among them now. The first tree she looked at seemed to, at first glance, to be not a tree at all, but a huge man with a shaggy beard and great bushes of hair. She was not frightened. She had seen such things before. But when she looked again, he was only a tree, though he was still moving. You couldn't see whether he had feet or roots, of course, because when trees move, they don't walk on the surface of the earth. They wade in it, as we do in water. The same thing happened with every tree she looked at. At one moment, they seemed to be the friendly, lovely giant and giantess forms which the tree people put on when some good magic has called them into full life. Next moment, they all looked like trees again. But when they looked like trees, it was like strangely human trees, and when they looked like people, it was like strangely branchy and leafy people. And all the time that queer lilting, rustling, cool, merry noise. "They are almost awake, not quite," said Lucy. She knew she herself was wide awake, wider than anyone usually is. She went fearlessly in among them, dancing herself as she leapt this way and that to avoid being run into by these huge partners. But she was only half interested in them. She wanted to get beyond them, to something else. It was from beyond them that the dear voice had called. She soon got through them, half wondering whether she had been using her arms to push branches aside or take hands in a great chain with big dancers who stooped to reach her, for they were really a ring of trees around a central open place. She stepped out from among her shifting confusion of lovely lights and shadows. A circle of grass, smooth as a lawn, met her eyes, with dark trees dancing all round it, and then, oh joy, for he was there! The huge lion shining white in the moonlight, with his huge black shadow underneath him. But for the movement of his tail, he might have been a stone lion. But Lucy never thought of that. She never stopped to think whether it was a friendly lion or not. She rushed to him. She felt her heart would burst if she lost a moment. And the next thing she knew was that she was kissing him, and putting her arms as far around his neck as she could, and burying her face in the beautiful rich silkiness of his mane. "Aslan, Aslan, dear Aslan," sobbed Lucy. "At last." So finally, she gets to see Aslan. she kind of starts to talk to him about, well, I saw you before in the woods, and I tried to talk my brothers and sister into following you, and they wouldn't believe me. They're also... And then from somewhere deep inside Aslan's body, there came the faintest suggestion of a growl. I'm sorry, said Lucy, who understood some of his moods. I didn't mean to start slanging the others, but it wasn't my fault anyway, was it? The lion looked straight into her eyes. Oh, Aslan, said Lucy, you don't mean it was? This sort of concept that Lucy could have followed Aslan on her own and been unafraid of how the others would react, right? And it's interesting, sort of keeping track of who is not blamed by Aslan, because that's the wrong word, but kind of sort of half rebuked by Aslan. He's a very Socratic rebuker, right? He just kind of looks at you after you say, oh, you don't mean this, I did this wrong, and oh shoot, I did this wrong. So yeah, it's just a lovely scene. Do y'all have thoughts?
Definitely have thoughts.
Yeah, a few thoughts.
Yeah, please.
I was thinking now, we've talked about a little bit, and I think it's so obvious throughout the whole story how you have Aslan's breath sort of animating the world and giving life. And so I thought it was really interesting sort of honing in on that one sentence that you read where it says it's as if there was they were moving as if there was wind, but there's no wind, which is doesn't seem like that crazy big of a description, but understanding Aslan's breath, sort of connecting it to the notion of ruach in the Bible and how it's God's spirit, his breath, that's animating and giving life. And so you sort of see as Aslan gets closer and closer, the trees are feeling that ruach and they're coming to life slowly but surely. And so I think that's really cool. And then again, that whole notion of all these things being shot through with joy. We were just kind of giggling over here as you were reading, because it was just obvious how it kept mounting up and up and up until Lucy literally says, oh, joy, because all of a sudden, all of these piercings that she's felt and experienced are revealed. And there's Aslan. He's the one that's been waiting the whole time.
Yeah, and specifically when she's walking among the trees, but she wanted to get beyond them to something else. It was from beyond them that the dear voice had called. And
yes,
of course, in Surprised by Joy, it's that constant repetitious theme of every taste of joy is pointing at something beyond, and experiencing that just gives you that hunger for the thing beyond. So we were just kind of laughing because this feels almost like the heart of Lewis's own personal story, but also kind of his philosophy of joy, which is so central to everything that he writes.
Yeah, and this is as someone who writes fantasy and science fiction, right? Lewis is very conscious of the fact that you don't have these sorts of myths that move people's hearts without God behind it. That it's not the trees themselves. She longs for the trees to be alive, but that's because the trees are echoes of something in the character of God, or manifestations, I guess, even is a way to view it. When the fuller manifestation is there, when the God incarnate in the form of a lion is there, then those things, while they still perform that function, they're not the main thing. I mean, the secular analogy I reach for is Gatsby's green light after he's hung around Daisy. It's so striking, and I think it's such a theme throughout this. Aslan being kind of the thing to which all of this magic ultimately points, if it's good magic.
Story-wise, I think it's interesting that this is sort of a little precursor, pre-taste of the party that's coming. And we'll see later that it turns into a party caravan with all the trees, and the animals are going wild, and the girls are riding on the back, and people are being sort of revived. And there's this great revival and great music and dancing and feasting and all this great, beautiful imagery of just a party. This little scene with Lucy, although it's so intimate and it's so sweet, it in itself is sort of like a little hint of where the story's going to end up, the big party at the end of the story.
I mean, Lewis is certainly, if he doesn't quite know what's going to happen as he's writing this, he has a really good mind for hinting at this sort of thing and then having a big, like you said, a real climax to these moments, right? A real kind of fulfillment of these kinds of promises that are being made. So Lucy's really happy, but then she realizes that she has to go back and wake up her brothers and sisters and tell them that they need to go right now. She wakes up Peter, and Peter's like, "Oh yeah, sure, Lucy," and then back to sleep. Wakes up Susan. Susan tells her to go back to sleep. She's being childish. Wakes up Edmund, and Edmund has very thoroughly learned his lesson in the last book. He shakes himself awake and grumbles, but they go and wake up the others. And that is how chapter 10 ends. Sophie and Mez, you were talking about Princess and Curdie, or the Princess and the Goblin, and more kind of echoes of that. What did you see there?
I think Mez should elaborate on this because this is like her favorite thing.
It is my favorite scene in The Princess and the Goblin, which is possibly my favorite MacDonald. Yeah, in The Princess and the Goblin, Irene is told by the great, etc. grandmother to go and bring Curdie. And of course, the grandmother knows that Curdie's not having any of it. He's a realist. He doesn't believe anything about, magic addicts and great old grandmothers and all of the magic. And yet she is forced to obey, despite the fact that she gets the slap in the face of Curdie saying she's being childish and lying, essentially. And it's so painful, but Irene has to do the faithful thing and do what her grandmother has told her to do. So this really feels like an echo of that as well, of Lucy having to go knowing the shame that she's about to bring down on herself, knowing she'll be resisted. And yeah, it makes me wonder actually how much of this was personal for Lewis, because you see it kind of come up several times with Lucy kind of having to take the shame of speaking the truth. And you think about Lewis and his context of academia, and I can only imagine that, there he is putting himself out there with all these apologetics books, and you wonder how difficult that was for him when he knew what the response would be from his peers.
Yeah, that's funny because I never think of Lewis as being, I think of Lucy as being like the mystic, right? The one who sort of sees the things that nobody else sees. And I think of Lewis as being so much more like Dr. Cornelius or something like that, right? Like just really more skeptical by nature. But I think, yeah, in relation to his community, his academic community, I imagine he must have felt like Lucy quite a bit. There were things that happened to him, even just by virtue of him reasoning them out, that he simply couldn't deny and wasn't interested in denying, even though he was very reluctant, right, to convert. Chapter 11, in which Lucy continues to forge ahead, follows Aslan, even though no one else wants to follow, and they have to follow Lucy, and Susan is kind of awful. They follow Lucy, following Aslan, over what seems to be a cliff, and once they get over it and realize it's not a cliff, that's the point at which they begin to see Aslan. It takes Susan and Trumpkin the longest to see Aslan, because Trumpkin, of course, is our materialist dwarf. He doesn't believe in magic, and finally Aslan kind of has a moment with each of them where he rebukes. Again, it's a very sort of Socratic rebuke. Are just meant to restore, I think, as soon as they convict. Peter says, "I'm so sorry. I was wrong about the direction to go. I didn't listen to Lucy. I should have." And all Aslan says is, "My dear son." Then for Susan, that's the harshest rebuke, which is, "You have listened to fear's child." So the only one who's not rebuked in any way this time around is Edmund, which is an interesting reversal to the last book. He's simply told, "Well done," and that's an interesting, just kind of a fun reversal, that Edmund is the one who comes through this time, because he was the one who was so very rotten in the first book. Your thoughts on any of that?
I think it's interesting comparing Lucy and Susan specifically, because Lewis says that Susan was acting like such a grown-up. And so I think it's just an interesting comparison between, a lot of times you have more of these skeptical grown-ups versus you have Lucy, who just is the epitome of a child with childlike faith, who just trusts. Edmund has figured out how to be on that path also, just to have that childlike trust of following someone, even though he doesn't understand why, specifically can't see Aslan himself. But this also plays in with education of how do you grow well? Do you grow up into a skeptical adult who squashes your imagination, like so many of the Telmarines? Or do you grow to become someone like Dr. Cornelius, like do you grow up to be somebody who still has that childlike faith, even as they're maturing? And not to just drag MacDonald into this again, but I was just thinking of in Lilith, which is probably my favorite of his works, there are the little ones who are these little people, and they're scared of growing up because they don't want to become like the bad giants, and they don't want to become like them. But there's this wrestle with the little ones need education and they need to grow. And so I think Lewis is playing with a similar sort of theme of what is the right kind of education to bring maturity, but not to turn you into a grown-up.
And if I can just agree with you with some of the text where Aslan meets with Lucy and she says, you look bigger. And he says, child, the older you grow, the bigger I will seem. That's a slight paraphrase, but that idea of when you're growing and your childlike faith is actually growing with you, it's actually the vehicle by which you grow in wisdom. Then God only gets bigger. He doesn't get smaller. So yeah, I think that is totally a major theme.
I echo everything that's everyone said. There's so many good points, but I think something that's an interesting element to this, and we see it throughout the book with other characters too, is this idea of bravery. Like Aslan's calling Lucy to be brave, and the children all have sort of moments of bravery. Aslan's calling them to trust them through the fog, through the valleys, even though they can't see them, like you have to trust. And it's the fact that Lucy has to go up and wake the other children and say, follow me, like it's this way, trust me. If I was a child reading this book, like that's such an intimidating situation to be in. Like, oh my gosh, I have to wake up my older siblings and all this peer pressure on me. And it's just that it's that childlike wonder and faith, but it's also that very simple, old-fashioned bravery. This is what I'm believing, and I'm just going to keep walking down this path no matter what people say or what people believe. I'm going to keep following Aslan. And we see here Lucy being called to that knightly attitude of, all right, Lucy, you have to be brave, but you also have to convince your brothers and sisters in a gentle way to follow you. Yeah, I love that so much.
Absolutely. Lewis has a great essay on chivalry that maybe we'll try and link to, where he discusses what you've just been saying, Logan.
The whole idea of chivalry was so important to Lewis and to Tolkien. Obviously, Aslan is a mixture of brave and terrible and powerful, but also incredibly loving and gentle with the children. But even in like Lord of the Rings, you see that Aragorn. He's the king conqueror, but also the healer. Great medieval picture that I think all the Inklings love so much. They put those ideals throughout so many of their books.
Yeah, it's funny. There's been kind of a movement to explain knights as, well, they weren't really like that, and Sir Lancelot, well, you know, they were basically just a bunch of brutes, and so we have all this stuff show up in the literature in order to like try to tame them a little bit because they're so awful. And I think to some extent, you know, I get that, but it also does miss the point, right? This kind of literature would not have been popular if it didn't fit into a view of the world that they already would have found appealing, that even if there were knights who were doing awful things, which there were, this sort of ideal of a knight it's not just propaganda, and it's not just sort of empty, we want you to act this way instead of the way you're acting, you jerky knights. Rather, something that has a lot of traction for medievals and something that they find that they can believe in. It's not just the Victorians who did. I also want to say to Sophie and Mez's point about, you know, growing up without growing up, right? In the negative sense of the term. I wonder if a lot more of this book than we think isn't about the redemption of Susan, or the attempted redemption of Susan anyway, because there's so much play kind of at the end of this chapter when Bacchus appears, you know, and the two girls go with Aslan and Bacchus and they go on this like wild romp, and then we hear more about that romp in a later chapter because it seems so out of left field and just weird. And the only thing that I can think is that like Lewis is like sticking it to Tolkien, saying, haha, you know, fawns do belong in a children's book. But yeah, I wonder if that element of play isn't very natural based on sort of what you all have been discussing and sort of bringing up. When they make it back to Aslan's house and they followed Aslan all the way back to where the stone table used to be, and now it's a big old mound, which is like a little bit like barrows, not barrows in Tolkien, sanctified barrows in England, or like a sanctified version of those barrows. But they make it back to Aslan's house, and suddenly there appears this army of trees, also Bacchus and Silenus. And Bacchus is like, is it a romp, Aslan? And Silenus, you know, very Fantasia-like, falls around on his mule and is like clearly drunk and yelling, refreshments. It's just strange appearance of these two characters. The crowd and the dance around Aslan, for it had become a dance once more, grew so thick and rapid that Lucy was confused. She never saw where certain other people came from, who were soon capering about among the trees. One was a youth, dressed only in a fawn skin, with vine leaves wreathed in his curly hair. His face would have been almost too pretty for a boy's if it had not looked so extremely wild. You felt, as Edmund said when he saw him a few days later, "There's a chap who might do anything, absolutely anything." He seemed to have a great many names: Bromios, Basileus, and the Ram were three of them. There were a lot of girls with him, as wild as he. There was even, unexpectedly, someone on a donkey, and everybody was laughing, and everybody was shouting, "Yuan, Yuan, yo, 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 yo," which is the best I can do with the Greek. "Is it a romp, Aslan?" cried the youth, and apparently it was, but nearly everyone seemed to have a different idea as to what they were playing. It may have been Tig, but Lucy never discovered who was it. It was rather like Blind Man's Buff, only everyone behaved as if they were blindfolded. It was not unlike Hunt the Slipper, but the slipper was never found. What made it more complicated was that the man on the donkey, who was old and enormously fat, began calling out at once, "Refreshments! Time for refreshments!" and falling off his donkey and being bundled onto it again by the others, while the donkey was under the impression that the whole thing was a circus and tried to give a display of walking on its hind legs. And all the time there were more and more vine leaves everywhere, and soon not only leaves but vines. They were climbing up everything. They were running up the legs of the tree people and circling round their necks. Lucy put up her hands to push back her hair and found she was pushing back vine branches. The donkey was a mass of them. His tail was completely entangled and something dark was nodding between his ears. Lucy looked again and saw it was a bunch of grapes. After that it was mostly grapes, overhead and underfoot and all around. "Refreshments! Refreshments!" roared the old man. Everyone began eating, and whatever hothouses your people may have, you have never tasted such grapes. Really good grapes, firm and tight on the outside, but bursting into cool sweetness when you put them in your mouth. Here there were more than anyone could possibly want, and no table manners at all. One saw sticky and stained fingers everywhere, and though mouths were full of laughter, never ceased, nor the yodeling cries of "Yuan, Yuan, yo, 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 yo," till all of a sudden everyone felt at the same moment that the game, whatever it was, and the feast ought to be over, and everyone flopped down breathless on the ground and turned their faces to Aslan to hear what he would say next. At that moment the sun was just rising, and Lucy remembered something and whispered to Susan, "I say, Sue, I know who they are." "Who?" "The boy with the wild face is Bacchus, and the old one on the donkey is Silenus. Don't you remember Mr. Tumnus telling us about them long ago?" "Yes, of course, but I say, Lou." "What?" "I wouldn't have felt safe with Bacchus and all his wild girls if we'd met them without Aslan." "I should think not," said Lucy. There's the end of the end of that chapter. It seems like a good place to end the first installment of our second half of Prince Caspian, since it mirrors the end of the second installment. But yeah, what do you all make of this?
I think this scene is is so much fun. I think it just feels so Lewis to bring pagan gods out of nowhere and throw them into the mix. But I love too of, when you read the myths about Bacchus or Dionysius when in the Greek myths, the man was crazy or the god was crazy, and you just had extreme, the parties weren't like parties like this, right? You have people being killed and all sorts of extreme wildness going on. I just keep saying extreme. And so I think it's cool how Lewis brings this under the reign of Aslan and what it looks like to see pagan gods and pagan mythology brought into its proper place. Not sort of just thrown out, but what does it look like when the proper king is over it, which I think is cool. And it was making me think too, I've been rereading Dante right now. And so seeing how there's sort of a long tradition of Christian authors taking these pagan themes and sort of co-opting them, bringing them into and fitting it really nicely into what the Christian story is and pulling all the pieces together. And so I love seeing how Lewis is following that same tradition.
Yeah, and I think it really is very consistent. I mean, there probably was some banter going on with Tolkien regarding this, because we all know Tolkien's feelings about Father Christmas and Bacchus just appearing out of thin air. But I think it is consistent with Lewis's way of seeing the great myth, and I think is theology poetry when he talks about paganism is better off for Christianity, that it sort of comes to its consummation in Christianity. And I feel like this is just a depiction of that theory, really. And like Sophie said, you know, the Bacchanali are a nasty bunch. in mythology, they're totally destructive. And yet when you see them coming into that submission, suddenly it's about redemption, not just consummation, but redemption of the pagan myths, all that is beautiful and good kind of coming into this beautiful party that Logan was talking about. So yeah, I think Tolkien can't have complained too much because, you know, that's the way Lewis came to Christianity in the first place. Thanks to Tolkien.
Yeah.
I totally agree with what Sophie and Mez are talking about. It's such a consistent view with other works of C.S. Lewis too. And again, it fits so nicely with the revival of the tree spirits, the revival of the water spirits, the revival of the animals. If nature itself is not just this plain sort of experience that we see in our world, it's super nature. It's this more intelligent, more vibrant, more alive revival of creation. And it fits so beautifully into that Christian idea of Christ isn't just redeeming us, he's redeeming the world through us. And he's, you know, the Holy Spirit it will make all things new. Again, I don't want to keep bringing up the space trilogy, but I love the space trilogy. As we're in this conversation, it reminds me so much of that scene in That Hideous Strength again, when the gods sort of come through and exist on the house, sort of land on Ransom and the protagonist team. And these average middle-aged English people sort of hanging out in the kitchen. They have these big swelling moments of dance and wittiness and joy and laughter and music. Suddenly people can play instruments that they've never played before. It's just that picture of C.S. Lewis taking nature and old mythology and the old gods, small g, and every element under the sun and placing it under Aslan, placing it under the sun in a way, and allowing it to shine and reflect back to Christ and reflect back to Aslan. It's so awesome. I love that. It really does stroke your imagination as a reader and make you wonder, like, well, what else could be redeemed? Like, what else in the world or in creation and literature, what else can be stoked and made alive through the Christian story?
Yeah, man, there's so much there in what all of you have said. I think all of that is absolutely true. I still think he's thumbing his nose at Tolkien just a little bit. Because that's in the letters where Tolkien's writing, I forget who he was writing, but yeah, he objected specifically to the part in Tumnus's house when he read, I mean to say, nymphs and their ways, the love life of a faun? Doesn't he know what he's on about? Another kind of complaint that he had about Narnia was that, like, well, you know, I've kind of written stuff that's sort of like this, and it's kind of weird to read good friend who's an author writing stuff that's kind of like your stuff. And I'm sure, you know, it's not like he took anything or anything, but it's just a bit weird. And like, so Lewis, including this part, having an actual like Christian bacchanal where they eat grapes, and then like Ents essentially like coming in as well.
It reminds me, I don't know, this may be a really weird stretch, so please forgive me. We can edit this out if it doesn't make sense. But if Tolkien was a kid playing with Legos, he would follow the Legos exactly to the instructions. If C.S. Lewis was a kid playing with Legos, he would make whatever he wants, not obeying any kind of rules of the mythology or that doesn't belong here. What is that? That's a brick from a different set. Like, what is that? They both make something beautiful, but one's sticking to the instructions, one's sticking very strictly to the quote unquote rules, and the other one's he's sort of freewheeling it a little bit more. And they both create beautiful creations, but yeah, they're both very different Lego masters.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think like even like Tolkien would figure out what the principles were that inspired the original like Lego designers, you know, and like extend those after much careful thought and experimentation with putting just the right Lego in.
Absolutely. Yeah. Tolkien is inventing new Lego blocks. He's making his own Lego blocks, and he's made a long 2,000-year-old history of all Legos of all time. And Lewis is over here just pulling all the different sets together and making it this beautiful set as well. So yeah, it's I don't know if that allegory works, but it helps me understand these two different builders of Legos, but instead of Lego bricks, it's mythology and history.
I think that works very well. Hits the spot.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Everything is awesome. Everything is cool when you're part of a team. Everything is awesome when we're living our dream.
Narnia is very much a grafted world, right? It's a world that takes parts of all of these different mythologies, right, and unites them under humans and ultimately under Aslan. It's a world that would not exist without the human world, because it's so sort of dependent on the human world in a way, right? They need sons of Adam and daughters of Eve to be their kings, right? And so with that, you have any human mythology being a candidate for
It's fair game. Yeah,
being
you're
real in
absolutely.
Narnia. But yeah,
You mentioned it on the last episode of how Lewis didn't really know what to do with Narnia until he came across Aslan. And now that we sort of think about it, of course, because Aslan is his base, he can literally pull in from everywhere as long as he aligns it underneath Aslan and as supporting Aslan. He can pull in from Norse mythology and ancient mythology and Greek mythology. And so yeah, it makes sense why it all clicked for Lewis when he found Aslan.
Yeah, and I think this absolutely fits with Sophie's point, is Lewis kind of being in this tradition, this medieval tradition of Dante, right? The medievals are not interested in if something's in the book, they're going to try to fit it into their system. And so it doesn't matter if these things are seem fundamentally opposed. They're going to try to find some way to harmonize them, because it makes the cathedral that much more ornate, right? And kind of beautiful and stunning and awe-inspiring, right? And that's absolutely the way that Lewis seems to be creating here. All right, so I want to know from you all, is there a mythology that is not in Narnia that you think could be fit in to Narnia? Could we do this to Aztec mythology, for example? It's got a lot of human sacrifice, right? Or is it possible to redeem these kinds of what we kind of think of as being slightly scarier mythologies?
I mean, there's always sort of the animation of nature. I'm thinking of Native American mythology.
Yeah.
Or even Chinese mythology. I think in Chinese mythology, there's a lot that you could work with and make a really cool story out of.
Yeah.
I'm surprised actually that Lewis didn't tie in more explicitly more Norse mythology. It feels like it's heavy on the Greek, because I get the sense that Norse is his bag.
Yeah, I wonder if he wasn't trying to tiptoe around Tolkien a little bit, even as he was thumbing his nose at him. Because Tolkien definitely is drawing on the Norse left, right, and center. You've got a nod to Fenris Ulf in the next chapter. You've got dwarves, right?
True.
No elves.
You have the dark and the light dwarf.
Yeah. And you've got giants. And I don't know if I can think of any other. There's kind of a world encircling serpent in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Not really. It's just a sea monster. Yeah. I also get a Celtic vibe from a lot of the tree stuff, and I'm not sure if that's justified. Yeah.
I was thinking sort of the green man as well. And a lot of sort of Celtic nature spirits as well. I think you're right about that.
All right. Well, sorry for the ridiculous question at the end. I try to find just an absurd question. Logan and Sophie and Mez, thank you all so much for joining us. Listeners, tune in for next part of Prince Caspian. Thanks for going along on this crazy Aslan following bacchanal. Bye.
Blessed encounter full of joy, unscheduled on the decent plan, with here an addict of Tolkien, there a Charles Williams fan.